The crowd believed they knew everything about Elvis Presley. They cheered when he bought dazzling Cadillacs. They applauded every mansion, every gold record, every sold-out arena. Newspapers loved to count his wealth, his fame, and the impossible life he seemed to live. But they never wrote about the smallest purchase he ever made, because no one imagined that an old acoustic guitar, worth barely $180, would one day leave an entire nation in tears. And no one, not the reporters, not the fans, not even Elvis himself, could have imagined that the most important concert of his life would happen in a place where there were no spotlights, no television cameras, and no ticket sales. It would begin with a tired man singing alone on a cold Memphis sidewalk, and it would end with thousands of people discovering what real greatness actually looked like. This is that story. The autumn air carried a chill through the streets of Memphis in the year 1969. Golden leaves drifted across Beale Street while the city moved with its usual rhythm. Neon signs flickered above crowded diners. Old blues poured from open windows. Tourists searched for famous landmarks while local musicians fought for another day of survival. For Elvis Presley, it was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon. Only 3 nights remained before his next sold-out performance. His band expected him to spend the afternoon rehearsing. His manager expected another meeting. His security team expected another crowded public appearance. Instead, Elvis quietly slipped away with only one bodyguard and drove himself across town. No reporters, no photographers, no announcement. He simply wanted a new acoustic guitar. There was a tiny family-owned music shop tucked between an old bookstore and a shoe repair business. Most people drove past it without ever noticing. Elvis had visited once, years before, long before the world called him the king. The little brass bell above the door rang softly as he stepped inside. The familiar scent of polished wood, old strings, leather guitar straps, and fresh varnish instantly surrounded him. For a brief moment, he was no longer the biggest star on earth. He was simply another musician. The shop owner, Benjamin Harris, nearly dropped the guitar he was tuning. "Mr. Presley!" Elvis smiled warmly. "Afternoon, Ben." You came back." "I told you I would someday." Benjamin laughed nervously. "I honestly thought you were joking all those years ago." Elvis shrugged. "I've learned life has a funny way of bringing people back." Benjamin quickly locked the front door to keep curious customers from interrupting. Rows of beautiful guitars covered the walls. Mahogany, rosewood, maple. Some were handcrafted by famous builders. Others had been imported from Europe only weeks earlier. Benjamin proudly carried down his newest arrivals. "This one is custom built." Another. "This one belonged to a famous Nashville session player." Another. "And this," he gently opened a velvet-lined case, "is probably the finest acoustic guitar I've ever had in this store." The wood shimmered beneath the lights. Its finish reflected every beam like glass. Elvis carefully picked it up. His fingers rested on the strings. One gentle chord echoed through the tiny shop. Rich, warm, perfect. Benjamin smiled. "I knew you'd like that one." Elvis nodded slowly. "It's beautiful." Then, something interrupted him. A faint sound drifted through the front window. It wasn't loud. In fact, most people would never have noticed it. But musicians hear things differently, especially musicians who once stood exactly where another struggling performer now stood. A cracked voice, a tired melody, strings buzzing out of tune, an old guitar barely holding itself together. Elvis stopped playing immediately. He looked toward the window. Benjamin sighed before Elvis even asked, "He's here again." "Who?" Benjamin glanced outside. "Thomas Carter." Elvis walked closer to the glass. Across the street stood a man who looked as though life had spent decades fighting against him. His jacket had been repaired so many times that almost none of the original fabric remained. His boots were separating at the soles. Gray hair escaped from beneath an old cap. Deep wrinkles framed exhausted eyes. He looked somewhere around 50 years old, maybe older, maybe younger. Hard times often erased the difference. His guitar looked even worse. The wood had split near the bridge. One corner had been glued together repeatedly. The finish had disappeared years ago. Several tuning pegs didn't even match. One string buzzed so badly that every chord sounded broken. Yet, Thomas kept singing. Not because people were listening, but because music was all he had left. A little girl paused beside him for a second. She smiled. Her mother quickly pulled her away. A businessman laughed as he walked past. Teenagers whispered jokes. Someone tossed a single penny into the guitar case. Another man accidentally kicked it over without apologizing. Coins rolled across the sidewalk. Thomas quietly bent down, picked up every single coin, placed them back inside, and continued singing without saying a word. Elvis never moved. Benjamin folded his arms. Every day, Elvis remained silent. Rain, silence. Heat, silence. Snow, nothing. Benjamin looked at Elvis. He never misses. Finally, Elvis asked the question. Does anyone ever stop? Benjamin shook his head. Not anymore. What happened? Benjamin leaned against the counter. Years ago, he played in local clubs. He was good, the best. What changed? Benjamin stared through the window. Life. The single word seemed heavier than anything else spoken that afternoon. Benjamin continued quietly. His wife became sick. He sold everything. The house, the truck, his instruments, the savings. Everything. Elvis listened without interrupting. When she passed away, Benjamin swallowed. He never really came back. What about family? A son. Where is he? Benjamin looked away. He died overseas during military service. Silence filled the shop. The music from outside somehow sounded even lonelier now. Benjamin continued. Thomas never touched alcohol. Never caused trouble. Never blamed anyone. He just kept singing. Elvis watched Thomas smile gently at another child walking by. The child smiled back. It was the first smile Thomas had received all afternoon. Then another passerby muttered something cruel. Several people laughed. Thomas lowered his eyes. But he kept playing. Elvis whispered almost to himself, They're laughing at the wrong man. Benjamin nodded. They see an old guitar. They don't hear the music. For several long moments, neither man spoke. Only Thomas's voice floated through the cold Memphis afternoon. It wasn't technically perfect. It wasn't polished. It wasn't powerful anymore. But there was something inside that voice. Pain, hope, gratitude, loneliness. Every note carried the weight of a lifetime. Elvis suddenly remembered another afternoon years earlier. He remembered standing outside small diners, tiny fairs, parking lots, places where nobody cared who he was. He remembered singing for spare change, remembered empty pockets, remembered people walking past as though he didn't exist. For just a second, he saw himself standing where Thomas now stood. The only difference, someone had once believed in Elvis. Colonel Parker had opened one door. Sam Phillips had opened another. A handful of strangers had seen something worth believing in. What if no one ever had? Would he still be singing outside stores? Would people laugh as they walked by? Would anyone stop? Elvis slowly placed the expensive guitar back into its velvet case. Benjamin looked confused. Didn't like it? Elvis smiled faintly. I loved it. Then why put it back? Instead of answering, Elvis walked deeper into the store. His eyes moved across dozens of instruments hanging on the walls, until he stopped. There it was. Not the most expensive, not the rarest, not covered in fancy decorations, but perfectly balanced. Solid spruce top, beautiful warm finish, comfortable neck, rich, clear sound. It was simple, honest, the kind of guitar meant to be played every single day. Benjamin lifted it down. This one? Elvis nodded. Benjamin checked the tag. $180. Elvis gently strummed one chord. The sound filled the room like sunlight. Warm, hopeful, alive. He smiled. This is the one. Benjamin began writing the receipt. For your concert? Elvis looked through the window once more. Thomas had finished another song. Only 2 coins rested inside his case. No, Elvis answered softly. Not for me. Benjamin looked up. What do you mean? Elvis carefully closed the guitar case, then looked directly at the old shop owner. I think... He smiled the same humble smile that had once charmed audiences around the world. I already own enough guitars. Outside, Thomas Carter began another song, completely unaware that his entire life was about to change forever. Thomas Carter never noticed the black Cadillac parked quietly across the street. He never saw the man sitting inside. He never realized that the most famous musician in America had just made a decision that would change 2 lives forever. The cold Memphis wind carried another verse of Thomas's song through the air as he closed his eyes and played the worn-out guitar resting against his chest. Each chord buzzed, each string rattled. Yet every note carried something that could never be bought. It carried truth. Elvis slowly stepped out of the music shop, the brand-new guitar case resting gently in his hands. There were no cameras, no screaming fans, no reporters waiting outside. Only the sound of an old man singing to people who had long since stopped listening. Thomas finished the final line of his song and lowered his head. Silence. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then a businessman tossed a single coin into the guitar case without even making eye contact. A group of teenagers laughed as they walked by. One of them mocked the way Thomas's guitar rattled. Another pretended to sing off-key, making his friends burst into laughter. Thomas forced a tired smile. He had heard worse, much worse. Years of standing on these sidewalks had taught him something. People could steal your money. Life could steal your family. Time could steal your youth. But only you could decide whether anyone stole your kindness. He bent down, picked up the lonely coin, placed it carefully inside the case, and whispered to himself, "Tomorrow will be better." He had whispered those same words every morning for almost 7 years. Sometimes he believed them. Sometimes he didn't. But he never stopped saying them. As he prepared to play another song, a pair of polished black shoes stopped directly in front of him. Thomas looked up. The afternoon sunlight made it difficult to see the man's face. All he noticed was an expensive dark jacket and a guitar case resting beside his legs. "You taking requests?" the stranger asked, with a warm smile. Thomas chuckled softly. "If I know the song." "How about," the man paused, "Love Me Tender?" Thomas smiled. "I've played that one more times than I can count." His fingers gently found the opening chords. The worn strings buzzed loudly. One of them nearly slipped out of tune. Still, he sang. His voice wasn't young anymore. It carried cracks, scars, years of grief. But every word came straight from his heart. As the song continued, something unusual began happening. People slowed down. A young couple stopped walking, then another. A little boy sat quietly beside his mother. Even the teenagers who had been laughing only moments earlier became silent. Thomas wasn't singing like someone trying to impress strangers. He sang like someone remembering the happiest day of his life. By the time he reached the final chorus, nearly 30 people had gathered around him. When the last note faded into the afternoon air, applause slowly spread through the crowd. Thomas lowered his head, embarrassed. "Thank you." The stranger standing before him clapped the loudest. Then he gently placed the guitar case on the sidewalk. "I think your partner deserves to retire." Thomas looked confused. "What do you mean?" The stranger slowly opened the case. Golden sunlight reflected across polished spruce wood. A flawless acoustic guitar rested inside like a priceless treasure. Thomas stared without breathing. His lips trembled. "No," he whispered. "No, you've got the wrong person." The stranger smiled. "I don't think I do." Thomas stepped backward. "I could never afford something like this." "I know." "I couldn't even pay half." "I know." "I couldn't pay one string." "I know." Thomas looked down, unable to meet the man's eyes. "So why?" The stranger picked up the guitar and placed it gently into Thomas's shaking hands. "Because someone once believed in me." Thomas's fingers barely touched the smooth wood. It felt unreal, too perfect, too beautiful. He looked as though he were afraid it might disappear. Tears slowly filled his eyes. "I don't even know your name." The stranger laughed softly. "My name isn't important today." "But someday." He gently closed Thomas's fingers around the guitar neck. "Your music will be." Thomas struggled to speak. "Sir, I'll never be able to repay this." The man smiled with complete certainty. I don't want you to repay me. Thomas looked up. What do you want then? The answer came quietly, so simple that almost everyone standing nearby would remember it for the rest of their lives. I only ask one thing. Thomas waited. If this guitar ever changes your life. The stranger paused. Promise me you'll use it to change someone else's. The words hung in the cold afternoon air. Thomas couldn't answer immediately. His throat tightened. Finally, he nodded. I promise. The stranger smiled. I believe you. Just then, one little girl standing in the crowd tugged on her mother's sleeve. Mom! Isn't that Elvis Presley? The mother gasped. Within seconds, whispers spread through the crowd. It's Elvis. Oh my God, it really is him. Thomas's eyes widened. He looked back at the man standing before him. His knees nearly gave way. Elvis. He tried to hand the guitar back. I can't accept this. Elvis gently pushed it toward him again. Yes, you can. Because it doesn't belong in my collection. He glanced toward the broken guitar lying inside Thomas's old case. It belongs in your hands. Thomas could no longer hold back his tears. He hugged the guitar against his chest as though protecting the last precious thing he had left in the world. I've buried my wife, my son, my dreams, he whispered through sobs. I thought God had forgotten where to find me. Elvis stepped closer. Then, without saying another word, he placed one hand on Thomas's shoulder. It wasn't the touch of a celebrity. It wasn't the gesture of a superstar. It was simply one broken musician reminding another broken musician that he wasn't invisible. The crowd erupted into applause. Some people cried openly. Others wiped away tears they hadn't expected to shed. Even Benjamin, the shop owner, stood quietly inside the doorway, unable to hide his emotions. Before leaving, Elvis reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Without anyone noticing, he slipped it carefully through the guitar's sound hole, letting it fall deep inside the instrument. No one saw him do it. Not Thomas, not the crowd. Not even his own bodyguard. It was a secret meant for another day. Elvis closed the guitar case and handed it back one final time. Take good care of her. Thomas smiled through his tears. I'll treasure her for the rest of my life. Elvis nodded. I know you will. Then he turned, climbed quietly into his Cadillac, and drove away. Thomas stood frozen on the sidewalk long after the car had disappeared. The guitar still rested against his heart. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel poor. He didn't feel forgotten. He didn't feel alone. That very evening, Thomas carried the new guitar home to the tiny apartment where Silence had lived ever since his wife passed away. He placed the instrument on the old wooden table. For several minutes, he simply stared at it, afraid to touch it, afraid it might all have been a dream. Finally, he strummed the first chord. The room instantly filled with the richest sound he had heard in decades. Thomas closed his eyes. Tears rolled slowly down his weathered face. Then he whispered words no one else was there to hear. I gave my word today. And somehow, I know this guitar isn't here to save my life. He gently smiled through his tears. It's here so I can help save someone else's. Outside his apartment window, the city lights of Memphis shimmered beneath the night sky. Neither Thomas nor Elvis could possibly know that only a few months later, this very promise would ignite a chain of events so extraordinary that newspapers across America would call it 3 months later. A single photograph brought Elvis Presley to complete silence. He had just finished rehearsing for another sold-out concert. The arena outside was already filling with thousands of screaming fans. Security guards hurried through the corridors. Producers checked lighting cues. Musicians tuned their instruments backstage. Everything was happening exactly as it always did. Until one small envelope arrived. It had no return address. Only 2 handwritten words appeared on the front. For Elvis. His assistant placed it on the dressing room table. It came with today's mail. Elvis nodded absent-mindedly. I'll look at it later. But something about the handwriting caught his attention. It looked familiar. Almost trembling, he slowly opened the envelope. Inside was an old newspaper clipping. A photograph slipped onto the table. Elvis picked it up. For several long seconds, he couldn't breathe. Standing beneath bright stage lights was Thomas Carter. The same worn face, the same gentle smile, but everything else had changed. He stood confidently before thousands of people, holding the very guitar Elvis had placed into his hands on that cold afternoon in Memphis. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They were standing, cheering, crying. Elvis unfolded the newspaper clipping. The headline stretched across the page. Former street musician raises millions for children fighting cancer. He blinked, then read it again and again. The article explained everything. Only weeks after receiving the guitar, someone had recorded Thomas singing in downtown Memphis. The recording spread from one local radio station to another. Soon, churches invited him. Schools welcomed him. Community theaters opened their doors. People didn't come because he was famous. They came because every song sounded honest. Every performance reminded people that hope could survive even the darkest tragedies. Thomas refused to keep the money. Instead, he donated every dollar to children's cancer hospitals across Tennessee. Families who couldn't afford treatment suddenly found anonymous bills being paid. Children received medicine. Hospitals bought new equipment. Entire wards were renovated. Every concert became another chance to save another child. Elvis lowered the newspaper. His eyes remained fixed on Thomas's smiling face. He kept his promise, he whispered. Just then, another folded sheet slipped from the envelope. It was a handwritten letter. Dear Mr. Presley, you probably don't remember an old man outside a music shop, but every child inside St. Mary's Children's Hospital knows your kindness, even if they've never met you. The guitar you gave me did far more than replace broken strings. It gave an old man permission to dream again. Every concert I play belongs to those children now. Every smile they wear began the day you stopped to hear a stranger's song. If you ever wonder whether one act of kindness matters, come see them. You won't need anyone to tell you the answer. With endless gratitude, Thomas Carter. Elvis quietly folded the letter. Without saying a word, he stood. His manager entered moments later. They're ready. Elvis looked at him. I need to postpone rehearsal. What? I have somewhere more important to be. Within an hour, a black Cadillac pulled quietly into the parking lot of St. Mary's Children's Hospital. There were no reporters, no photographers, No television cameras. Elvis had asked everyone to keep his visit private. He wanted no headlines, only answers. As he stepped through the hospital entrance, the smell of disinfectant replaced the excitement of concert arenas. The halls were lined with colorful drawings. Tiny handprints decorated the walls. Children walked slowly beside IV poles. Parents smiled with tired eyes that hadn't known proper sleep in weeks. A nurse recognized Elvis immediately. Before she could speak, he placed one finger gently to his lips. "Please." "I don't want anyone to stop what they're doing." She smiled. "I understand." Soft music echoed somewhere deeper inside the building. Elvis followed the sound. Each step made his heart beat faster. Finally, he reached a doorway. He stopped. Inside sat nearly 50 children. Some wore masks, some had lost their hair, some sat in wheelchairs. Others rested in hospital beds pushed together into one large room. At the front, Thomas Carter sat on a simple wooden chair. The guitar rested comfortably in his hands. He wasn't performing for applause. He wasn't performing for money. He was performing for children who desperately needed one reason to smile. Thomas began singing, "You Are My Sunshine." Tiny voices slowly joined him. One little girl clapped off rhythm. A young boy laughed every time Thomas missed a note on purpose just to make him giggle. Parents quietly wiped tears from their faces. Doctors leaned against the walls, smiling. For nearly an hour, no one spoke. No one looked at their watches. The world outside simply disappeared. Elvis stood hidden behind the doorway the entire time. His own eyes filled with tears. He had performed before kings, before presidents, before hundreds of thousands of fans, yet nothing compared to what he was witnessing now. When the final song ended, thunderous applause filled the room. Not because Thomas had sung perfectly, but because, for one beautiful hour, the children forgot they were sick. Thomas smiled warmly, then looked at the children. "I need every one of you to remember something." The room became quiet. "There was a time when I believed my life was over." He gently rested his hand on the guitar. "I had lost my wife, my son, my future. I thought no one could ever need me again." He smiled softly. Then one stranger stopped to listen. The children listened carefully. "He didn't give me charity. He gave me belief. And belief," he looked around the room, "can keep a heart beating long after hope disappears." At that moment, Thomas reached inside his jacket. He pulled out an old screwdriver. The children looked confused. "So many of you have asked why I never let anyone repair this guitar." He smiled. "Today, I'll show you." He carefully loosened the strings, unscrewed the back panel that had once been repaired years earlier, reached gently inside. His fingers found something, a tiny folded piece of paper, yellowed with time. Thomas unfolded it carefully. His hands trembled. "I've never opened this." The room fell completely silent. Even Elvis leaned forward from the hallway. Thomas slowly read the handwritten words. One sentence. Just one. "One day, your music will give people more hope than mine ever could." Thomas stopped reading. His voice disappeared. The room blurred through tears. The children didn't fully understand why he was crying, but every adult did. Thomas looked toward the doorway. For the first time, he noticed someone standing there. Elvis. Neither man spoke. They simply looked at one another. Thomas smiled through tears. Elvis smiled back. The children turned. Gasps filled the room. "That's Elvis Presley!" Within seconds, the children surrounded him. Instead of standing apart like a superstar, Elvis knelt beside them. He laughed. He hugged them. He signed drawings instead of photographs. For the next 2 hours, no one talked about fame. Only hope. As evening approached, Elvis quietly pulled Thomas aside. "I have an idea." "What kind of idea?" "The biggest audience you've ever seen." Thomas laughed. "I'm too old for that." Elvis smiled. "No. You've finally become ready." 1 week later, America expected Elvis Presley to perform another historic concert. More than 20,000 tickets had already been sold. Reporters from across the country filled the arena. Everyone expected the king of rock and roll. Instead, the stage remained empty. The lights dimmed. A giant screen slowly illuminated. Elvis walked alone to the microphone. The arena exploded with cheers. He waited until complete silence returned. Then he spoke. "Tonight, I've decided not to be the most important person on this stage." Confused whispers spread through the crowd. Elvis smiled. "A few months ago, I met a musician who reminded me why music exists." He stepped backward. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my friend, Thomas Carter." An old man slowly walked onto the stage carrying a simple acoustic guitar. The same guitar. The arena became silent. Thomas looked terrified. Elvis leaned close and whispered, "They're not here to judge you. They're here to hear your heart." Thomas nodded. He closed his eyes. His fingers touched the strings. The first chord echoed across the arena. Warm, pure, alive. 20,000 people stopped breathing. By the second verse, thousands of phone lights filled the darkness. By the chorus, people were openly crying. Parents held their children, strangers embraced. Even security guards wiped tears from their eyes. Backstage, musicians stood frozen. No one had ever witnessed anything like it. When the final note faded, silence remained. Not because the audience disliked it, because no one wanted the moment to end. Then, the loudest standing ovation in Memphis that year erupted like thunder. Thomas looked toward Elvis. Elvis remained standing in the shadows beside the curtain, clapping, smiling, never once trying to take the spotlight back. The next morning, newspapers across America carried the same photograph. Not Elvis, not the roaring crowd, not the flashing lights. Only one old musician holding one simple guitar while children from St. Mary's Hospital smiled in the front row. The headline read, "Sometimes legends aren't remembered for the songs they sing. Sometimes they're remembered for the lives they quietly teach others to change." Years later, people would ask Elvis Presley which performance meant the most to him. They expected him to name a sold-out stadium, a television special, a gold record. Instead, he always smiled before giving the same answer. "It wasn't my concert. It was the day I watched hope sing through someone else's guitar. Because real legends are not measured by the size of their audience. They are measured by how many hearts continue beating because someone chose kindness when no one was watching. And on one ordinary afternoon in Memphis, a guitar worth $180 proved that a single act of compassion could echo farther than a lifetime of applause. The music ended, the applause faded, but the hope born from that simple gift never did.